So the oceanic perspective, specifically from Indian Ocean perspective, also gives a very broad overview to look at global history. It's not only from a perspective of a particular nation or a specific region, but we get a very transcontinental global perspective from Africa to Arabia to Asia to even Australia. Ocean is a space that sort of brings people together. And Islam also, specifically in this context, we see how that contributes to the ways in which communities over several centuries have traveled and interacted with one another. And both the ocean contributed to the making of Islam as much as Islam contributed to the ways in which people traveled and traded and adventured across the ocean. In Kerala, from at least 16th century onward, we have three major traditions, three major intellectual traditions, which is the case anywhere else in the Islamic world. So we have a significant number of works in mysticism, law, and ethics. So I wanted to study all these traditions. So I started with law, and I still haven't managed to go to the other two parts. To reiterate, it is not specifically about law that got me interested, but to show this diverse intellectual tradition that Malayali Muslim community have produced, which is not, again, very unique to Kerala, but rather part of many other communities whose histories from the Swahili coast to Malay world, whose intellectual contributions still continue to be ignored. And I wanted to explore this work across time and space. So it's basically, even though it's a history of the entire Indian Ocean and particularly one stream of Islamic legal tradition, it is also history of one book and the different descendants or different children that this book produced over several centuries. So it's basically a text and its family. What I call in my book a textual family. So by looking at the ways in which this one legal text, a text of law, a law book written initially in 13th century in Damascus in Eastern Mediterranean context in present-day Syria, how that text found its way into East Africa, into South Africa, into India, into Indonesia, into Philippines. And also it's not only communities in these places receiving this one, they had their own assertions. So people from Kerala as well as from Sri Lanka or from Malaysia would have their own interpretations and their own organic critiques of this tradition. So I tried to look at, basically, even though it's a very vast space that I look at, it is basically a micro history of a book and its descendants or its grandchildren and grandchildren. In Arabic, it's called Minhajut Talibin, a guide for students, which is a very broad title, but yeah. What is very remarkable is that Malayali Muslim community, they had a very enormous, very rich intellectual tradition, which is not acknowledged in Indian historiography as well as in South Asian historiography. It is primarily, once it comes to the Muslim communities, mainly on the North Indian Muslims. So the Mughals and the Delhi Sultanate and the Bengal Sultanate or Gujarat and so forth. But very rarely like a marginal community like Kerala Muslims or the Tamil Muslims or the Telugu Muslims get acknowledged. The members in this community sort of celebrated the poets and the jurists and the scholars of Kerala, for example. Instead of dismissing their Malayali identity, they sort of celebrated that in their intellectual exercises, and they did it by celebrating, for example, their ruler, who is a Hindu king, in this case the Zamorin. They articulated that he is the best ruler and better than many other Muslim rulers. For example, Akbar as the great ruler, but none of them acknowledge even Akbar as a great ruler. Rather, they celebrate the Zamorin, and they write it very clearly. He is the best a Muslim can have as a ruler. So it's not only about the Muslim identity, but also how they conceptualized within the frameworks of Islamic law how they conceptualized the local communities in the region, like the Brahmins, the Nayars, Christian community, as their brothers and sisters. And to do that from a legal perspective is a very organic, intellectual way. This is like, some of the features in which we find, how these communities conceptualize this before the categories such as, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, or Brahmin, Nair, all of which became sort of problematic caste, religious, ethnic categories. So for a time before that, people sort of celebrated these identities, and instead of dismissing them, they sort of internalized and then supported that. And that is also a critique that they proposed to the Arab-centric understandings of Islam and Sharia and so forth. Today we have a very different understanding of law controlling all the other dimensions of the society, such as politics, law, and so forth. Whereas law evolved very organically. Again, it is a multi-directional process. As much as society, economy influences law, law also influences them. What is very important is that in a pre-modern context, that the state law or state doesn't have a monopoly over law. Today, state sort of claims a monopoly over law. For example, if you take a place like Cochin in 16th or 17th century, there are multiple legal systems operating simultaneously. So this is an important dimension that we have to keep in mind. Scholars identify it in terms of legal pluralism, which is an old debate, but then legal plurality is something like, scholars have now proposed, different legal traditions existing in support of one another, but also in isolation from one another. So instead of one legal system of, let's say, Islamic law or any other law controlling entirely the society, economy, and politics, they all sort of, contributed to one another, and they existed across these places. And especially in an Indian Ocean context, where people from all sort of different backgrounds coming together, this is something that we see, as a major feature. Having a network of scholars, of like-minded people supporting each other is very key on one dimension. And the second dimension is that some of us, or many of us, have been very fortunate to get an exposure with international academia, with national academia. So as part of a network that I am mostly involved, ISHORE is called Institute for Social Science, Humanities, and Oceanic Research. Something that we have been trying to do is to bring scholars from all over the world, all over the country, with shared interest in history and culture of Kerala, to have these conversations where we, like to explore and support each other in whichever way we can. And that collaboration is the key, and I think that is the way forward. And it is almost impossible for any individual researcher to master all the languages, to know all the materials, no matter how many lives you get, in the life circle. If you believe in life circle, no matter how many life cycle or how many lives or how many hours you spend, still it is impossible to do, to do justice all the sort of materials available. And so Kerala is a very small region, and the same goes for all the other regions in Indian subcontinent, in Asian continent, in Indian Ocean broadly. So the collaboration is the way forward, and that is very important. In the long run, something that I would like to explore, rich manuscript cultures or manuscript traditions of Indian subcontinent, as well as the broader Indian Ocean. And we have this enormous amount of sources now available online, thanks to the digitalization projects of different institutions from all over the world. These digitalized materials are yet to be studied in a comparative or connective perspective, and I would like to develop that as a significant project, because one example that I often give is that the digitalized material available from a place like Tanzania a 30% of those materials are very similar to the digitalized materials available from a country like Indonesia. And these two countries are thousands of miles apart. And these manuscripts, before the age of print, if we have these materials, very similar materials, studying them in a connected perspective, comparative perspective, is something that I would like to do with the help of many other like-minded scholars in the field, young and established researchers in the field. It's immensely humbling and immensely surprising that such a diverse array of scholars have read my work. For example, my book is written for a specific, very niche audience in the history of Indian Ocean, but also within that, history of Islamic law. And to realize that such eminent scholars from all sort of different fields have read the work and then assessed it positively. I find the Infosys Prize as a recognition to the fields of Indian Ocean history, fields of Islamic legal history, Islamic intellectual history, and so forth.